Welcome to this month's Creation Justice webinar, a gathering place for building a faith-rooted and faith-sustained movement addressing some of the most pressing issues facing our world today. I'm Brooks Barrett, the Environmental Justice Minister for the United Church of Christ. I am joined by my esteemed co-host, the Reverend Michael Malcolm, the Executive Director for the People's Justice Council and Alabama Interfaith Power and Light. Before I introduce our guest today, Michael, I'm interested in getting your thoughts in framing this conversation. Lately, I've been wrestling with the fact that we have all these fires and floods, but climate disasters by themselves don't seem to spark change, pardon the pun. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, Brooks, it is amazing to me when you talk about the disasters not sparking the response necessary. I'm not sure exactly what disaster it's going to take, and I don't know if we can even afford to have that disaster for us to come together. If at anything, the reason why we join on this call is not just to call attention to the disasters, but to our stewardship in itself, and being able to call people into a place of stewardship, and not just a stewardship just for stewardship's sake, but good stewardship based on our belief and our values, not just as a United Church of Christ and those of Christianity or faith belief, but those people of conscience as well who would join this call, who want to be responsible and want to see what communities of faith are speaking about in this hour concerning the devastations that take place. And while we're talking about fires, I want to make sure, because I do advocate against biomass, particularly in the Southeast, because of the fact that they are stripping our trees at alarming rates. And we are experiencing flooding, and we are experiencing wildfires that are unnatural disasters, because they are man-made catastrophes that happen to us because of our stewardship. And so we're here to call those people of conscience, those people of faith, back to stewardship, but a stewardship in a good way of working with planet and people. I'm interested in hearing what our experts have to say, and I look forward to hearing from them from here on. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Michael. If only we could record you and I could just listen to your inspiring words and presence and wisdom at any time. Oh, yes, we do that. So I'm grateful that we have this recorded, and I am grateful now that we are going to introduce three outstanding panelists for today. I'll introduce them in the order in which they'll be speaking. Up first, we will have John Vaillant, who is a journalist and author whose work has appeared in The New Yorker, The Atlantic, National Geographic, Outside, and The Guardian, among others. He is the author of several award-winning, best-selling nonfiction books, including The Golden Spruce, The Tiger, and most recently, Fire Weather, A True Story from a Hotter World. Of particular interest to Vaillant are stories that explore collisions between human ambition and the natural world. Up next, we'll have Shana Udvardy, who is a senior climate resilience policy analyst with the Climate and Energy Program at the Union of Concerned Scientists. She conducts research and policy analysis to help inform and build support to increase resilience to climate change impacts. Shana enjoys paddle boarding on the Anacostia River in Washington, D.C. with her dog, Moose. And then we have Rick O'Rourke, who has lived most of his life on the banks of the lower Klamath River for more than 10 years. He has been working with the Cultural Fire Management Council, which facilitates the practice of cultural burning on the Yurok Reservation and ancestral lands. Rick and the council, Rick has been using fire as a tool for around 45 years. John, we now turn to you to get us started. We welcome you here today.
Thank you so much. I'm really glad to be with you all, and was really resonating to what Michael was saying earlier. So I'm a journalist and author based in Vancouver, British Columbia, born and raised in the United States. My latest book that took me, frankly, 7 years to finish is Fire Weather, and it really looks at what I'm calling 21st century fire. It's fire, but burning in a way that we really haven't seen before, that is impacting communities, forests, and firefighters in ways that it has not previously. And those are not good ways. And I documented this in great detail, focusing in particular on a fire that swept through the petroleum town of Fort McMurray in 2016. And Fort McMurray is in the Canadian province of Alberta. Alberta is in Western Canada, just north of Montana. It's about the size of Texas. And one way to understand what Alberta means to Canadians and kind of in our consciousness is it's really the Texas of Canada. So it's very dedicated to the petroleum industry, lots of cows, lots of cowboys. We just had the Calgary Stampede that you may have heard of, lots of wide open spaces, quite a fractious relationship with the federal government. It's a very independent, hardworking province. And it's also happens to be the largest source of foreign petroleum for the United States. So that's why it matters. Almost half of America's foreign imports come out of Alberta, specifically out of Fort McMurray, which is 600 miles north of the U.S. border in the boreal forest. And the boreal forest is that gigantic green forest system that runs all the way around the northern hemisphere, through Russia as the taiga, across northern Europe and Scandinavia, through Newfoundland, all the way across the northern Canada and Alaska. So in the middle of this gigantic forest is the city of Fort McMurray, sitting on a huge reservoir of bitumen. Bitumen is tar, but if you melt it and heat it up enough with natural gas, you can basically wrestle it into a form that can be ultimately rendered into synthetic crude oil. And that is what is piped down into refineries on the US border. So it's a huge industry, multi-billion dollar, tens of thousands of people work there. And on May 3rd, 2016, a massive fire swept through the city. About 75,000 permanent residents, another 30,000 or so temporary workers who work in the petroleum industry. And the result was the largest evacuation due to fire in modern times. In a single afternoon, the entire city was emptied. People did not return there for a month. So besides New Orleans, no other North American city has been disinhabited for that long. But the nature of this fire is what was so shocking to firefighters, to civilians, and to me once I started really paying attention to it. WUI is also known as the wildland-urban interface. And this is where the forest meets the built environment. And this is important because basically a third of American homes are built in the WUI. And when we're talking about the WUI, we're talking about, you got a nice cul-de-sac out front where Junior can, ride her scooter, and out the back are running trails into the woods. And this is a really beautiful place to live until it catches on fire. Half of Canadians live under these conditions, about a third of Americans, and it's a really desirable place to build new houses. And most of the houses in Fort McMurray, because it is a petroleum boom town, are new. And many of them are built, basically all of them are built in the WUI. And on May 3rd, we had some very unusual conditions. And these are conditions now that are spreading all the way across Canada, which is why a lot of Canada is frankly on fire right now as I speak to you. It's a really devastating situation in the north of our country right now. On May 3rd, 2016, the temperature was about 92 degrees Fahrenheit. So we're talking the boreal, this is the subarctic. Normal temperatures would be around 65 Fahrenheit. So we're 30 degrees over the norm. We've broken the standing heat record for that day by 10 degrees, and the relative humidity, the moisture in the air, is at 11%. And to put that into perspective, Death Valley in July hovers around 15% relative humidity. So Fort McMurray on May 3rd, 2016 was drier than Death Valley and as hot as Southern California, but we're in Northern Canada here. So when that fire that had been burning outside of town for 2 or 3 days got some wind in it, in the direction of Fort McMurray, it blew into town, pushing heat ahead of it that was 1,000 degrees. So what a fire or a candle, any heat source does is it projects radiant heat, and radiant heat moves at the speed of light. So this gigantic fire system that was now miles wide, rushing into the city of Fort McMurray, everyone was still in town. No evacuation had been ordered, pushing 1,000-degree heat that caused everything in front of it for hundreds of yards ahead to dry out instantly and to attain temperatures way beyond combustion. So when that fire finally hit the neighborhood, these houses did not catch on fire the way we normally think about houses catching on fire. They exploded into flame. So $500,000, 2-story, state-of-the-art homes of people just like us, though perhaps more prosperous because of the industry they work in, their homes burnt to the basement in 5 minutes. And when firefighters started running this number by me, I really couldn't believe it. I was really skeptical. And then I asked other firefighters, I asked other civilians, and then I started talking to physicists. And when you have a firestorm type situation that is superheating everything in front of it, you can indeed have these kinds of ultra rapid burn times. And that is what 21st century fire is capable of now. And a number of communities in the American West have suffered from this. Folks in Greece, Spain, Portugal, there have been some really devastating fires, also in British Columbia recently. And right now, evacuations are literally underway, again, as I am talking to you. So it's a really dire situation with a new kind of energy that firefighters really can't combat. So they are going in there fully intending to confront that fire, as firefighters are trained to do. They are encountering temperatures like Venus, 800, 900 degrees, flames 100 feet high. You can blow all the, you can shoot a fire hose at that all day long, and the water will evaporate into steam 100 meters before it even hits the fire itself. So these firefighting operations are increasingly turning into life-saving operations. And so that's all they can do, is get the people out as rapidly as they can and let it burn. And Fort McMurray burned for days. The fire did not leave the city until a week later. This has really never happened in history. The fire continued to burn through work camps, up across into the the bitumen upgrading facilities, shutting down this multi-billion-dollar industry for a couple of weeks. It had never happened before. This was an unprecedented situation, the most expensive natural disaster in Canadian history. So truly devastating. And when I started researching this, I realized, okay, this is, as far away and as remote as it may be, this is not a one-off. This is not a freak event. Because when I went up and started looking at the circumstances there was ice still on the lakes. This is how early spring it was in the northern boreal of Alberta. There was still ice on the lakes. There were car-sized blocks of ice sitting on the main river, the Athabasca River. And then the temperature flipped around to the low 90s, and this unbelievable fire burnt into the city and would not leave. It was nicknamed the Beast because it wouldn't quit. It was like Godzilla, and Godzilla was not happy. So that's a fire that really kept my attention since then, since 2016, which really wasn't very long ago. Many countries around the world have had the worst fire seasons in their history. We all heard about Australia in 2019, 2020, unbelievable nationwide fires. California has had 10 or 12 of its worst fires ever just in the past few years. Oregon, British Columbia had its worst fire season ever until this season in 2017. And now these fires are sweeping eastward. So fires are, burning houses down, whole communities down in Nova Scotia. and that's the land of rain and fog. And I guess I'm out of time. Time got away from me there. There's more I wanted to say. I hope we'll have a chance to chat about it later. Thanks very much, everybody.
Thank you so much, John. And we'll have some time later, hopefully during Q&A, you'll be able to squeeze in some of that great insight that you were giving to us. Shana, we'll now turn things over to you.
Fantastic. The recently published work that we did called The Fossil Fuels Behind Forest Fires has helped us think about this wicked problem of reducing wildfire risk and helping to safeguard communities. So the findings from our analysis link the area burned by forest fires and the increases in drought and fire danger conditions to heat trapping emissions from the largest global carbon producers. So we did this study because we wanted to put a spotlight on the fossil fuel industry's role in driving the West's worsening wildfires so they can be held accountable for their fair share of costs. We found that heat trapping emissions tied to the world's 88 largest fossil fuel companies and cement companies have dramatically increased forest fire activity in Western North America. So specifically, we found that nearly 40% of the total area burned by forest fires in the region since 1986 is attributable to the emissions of these 88 major carbon producers. So this amounts to nearly 20 million acres, or the size of Maine. And the emissions from these companies are responsible for roughly half of the increase in fire danger conditions since 1901. So it's these hot, dry conditions that enable wildfires to burn more forest area. And we know that local communities are bearing the brunt of the harms of fossil fuel companies that they've caused through both heat trapping emissions and their decades-long disinformation campaigns. So we're hopeful that this new evidence in hand, that policymakers, elected officials, and legal experts will be better equipped to truly hold fossil fuel companies accountable in public, political, and legal arenas. So our first policy recommendation on the left going towards the right is that we need to really hold public officials responsible for establishing corporate climate accountability. And this looks like a handful of different things. First, the United States Securities and Exchange Commission should finalize, implement, and enforce strong rules mandating standardized corporate climate disclosure. We need Congress and the Department of Justice to investigate past ongoing climate disinformation by fossil fuel companies and their surrogates. And we need public prosecutors to hold fossil fuel polluters accountable for climate deception and the damages. We're also asking the Biden administration to follow through on its pledge to strategically support climate-related lawsuits against polluters. And finally, we must hold Congress to accountable for denying fossil fuel polluters immunity from liability for climate deception or damages. And we know that these damages disproportionately harm Black and Brown communities and communities of low income. Second, we need to hold the United States accountable for meeting its commitments to reduce heat trapping emissions. And the US must rapidly cut heat trapping emissions 50 to 52% below 2005 levels by 2030. And we need to achieve net zero emissions no later than 2050. So this is a big lift. And to do this, we need to rapidly implement the 2022 Inflation Reduction Act. We need strong carbon pollution and methane standards. And we need to do everything we can do to enact policies to advance clean electricity, energy efficiency, zero emissions vehicles. And we need to advance mass transit, electrification of buildings, industrial processes, and finally invest in healthy soils and forests, which can help store carbon. Our third recommendation is really focusing in on reducing human-ignited wildfires. While we know climate change is making conditions more conducive to wildfire, people are responsible for igniting most wildfires in Western North America. These, for example, include things like failures of electricity infrastructure, which have kindled some of the largest and deadliest wildfires on record. So Congress and states can help by passing legislation directing utility companies to plan and implement measures that prevent energy infrastructure from sparking fires and ensure critical equipment is actually functional. And in the wildland-urban interface, we know that this is an area that has many solutions that we can implement. It's one of the fastest growing land use types in the United States, and this is exacerbating wildfire risk and the number of homes burned. So there's role and work for state, county, and city agencies to do on reducing wildfire risk by implementing land use regulations. Specifically, local governments who are responsible for land use zoning must enact policies to limit new buildings in the WUI and adopt the latest WUI building codes. The good news is that constructing buildings to the latest building codes can actually save $4 on every dollar invested due to the preventable future losses. Finally, homeowners have to have skin in the game as well who live in these areas, and they can do this by adopting defensible space mitigation measures, such as removing combustible items and installing non-combustible hardscapes, such as rocks surrounding their home. Finally, our solutions focus on protecting community health and safety as well. So what this looks like is thinking about how Congress can work to pass legislation directing agencies to improve modeling of wildfire behavior and smoke and improve the real-time safety communications to the public, local officials, and wildland firefighters. We also want Congress to make permanent the temporary pay increase for essential federal wildland firefighters and support their health and mental well-being overall. Currently, there's a bill called the TIMS Act that was introduced recently. And the last recommendation in this area is that Congress could also extend the 10-year disaster fund for the U.S. Forest Service and the Department of Interior to sustain the financial safety net for fire suppression costs. We also want to work to increase the resources for forest health. We want to help restore the health of Western forests in particular, and we're hoping that Congress sustains funding for identifying at-risk forests and scaling up forest treatments. We also want to invest in ecologically informed thinning and long-honed indigenous practices such as cultural burning or prescribed burning, which can help reduce the spread and severity of fires and provide other benefits to the ecosystem. So an overarching recommendation is, among all of these different categories, is the need to advance, track, and coordinate equitable investments. We know there are quite a few investments in the last two infrastructure bills, so we're working to understand and make sure that those investments are implemented and implemented in a just way. As I mentioned earlier, many of the low income and historically disadvantaged communities are being impacted first and worst. The analysis of the 2018 Camp Fire in California was an unfortunate poster child of this, where many of the elderly who had difficulty evacuating lost their lives. And there were also mental health and other types of issues of folks who were impacted by the fire. So we want to see how well the Biden administration will be implementing its Justice 40 initiative. And that's an initiative directing federal agencies to target 40% of certain resources to underserved communities. We also want to be sure that federal agencies aren't overburdening low income and low resource communities by ensuring that they meet federal funding matches or reporting requirements. So really trying to help communities get grants, but not making them match these federal funding requirements or have tough report requirements. And finally, we can look and see what the Wildland Fire Mitigation and Management Commission is doing. They should be coming out with a report and framework for wildfire management. And so we will be looking to the commission and looking to see what their recommendations are. And next slide, please. Finally, I wanted to end just by letting folks know that we do have many different resources available for you online, many of which are also in Spanish. So I look forward to answering any questions, and we'll put my video back on, and you can contact me if you need any specific resources. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Shana. We really appreciated that information and perspective and insights that you were able to give us. We're fortunate now to have Rick with us. He's joining with us by phone. Rick, are you able to hear and speak to us?
I am.
Terrific. We can hear you. We have introduced you, and you're ready to go.
Thank you so much. My name is Rick O'Rourke. I'm a member of the Cultural Fire Management Council. We are a native-led 501c3 nonprofit organization that is determined to bring back our use of fire in our landscape to help manage it. We've been doing this for 10 years plus, and I've been using fire as a tool for around 45 years. When we go into our landscape to try to bring it back into balance, we use a low-intensity fire, but first we do a lot of extensive treatment to make sure that we can keep our fire inside of our holding lines. I'm a qualified wildland firefighter and a cultural fire practitioner. With the recent wildfires, we've seen the need to bring back ancestral fire to help create a fuel breaks, reduce the fuels, reduce the ladder fuels, bring back our landscape into what it used to be, which is basically an oak savanna mostly, and now it's it's congested with encroachment trees, mostly firs, and they are encroaching upon all of our prairies, which would be food for our animals and medicine plants and food plants, and a lot of the necessities that we need to survive. We started using fire so that because most of our materials are serotinous, which is a fire-based plant, which thrives with fire to help bring it back into balance, like I said. When we run a low-intensity fire through our landscape, reducing the leaf litter and down in dead trees, it sequesters carbon into the ground and allows that water to be filtered through that carbon as it gets into our tributaries, which are now pretty much congested with Giardia and E. coli and a lot of other parasites that make it no good for us. So as we put fire into there, it helps to strengthen and create a stronger symbiosis between our plants and animals and our people. The healthier our water system is, the healthier our people are. So as we move forward and start to clean up our landscape, we help make a healthier climate for our people, our animals, the birds, our trees, our animals, and things that we need to survive. We don't just go and put fire on the ground and expect it to do its thing. We do a lot of preparation and extensive man hours so that we don't have a wildfire. We don't have to call in the world to put it out. We can maintain it and have successful burns. Let's see. We have a botanist who is doing a great job. We do inventories of plants before we go into a unit and after we go into a unit, and subsequently we see that the plants that we are trying to nurture are coming back in droves. It's amazing. The animals that are coming back are the species. It's amazing. It's phenomenal. The species I knew that were around that I've never seen, but then after fire, I've been seeing them. The community is really supportive and behind us, and that's really great in this time because most people are really scared of fire. I was in Oregon and we were doing some fire up there and a little bit of smoke and they shut us all down. But what we don't understand is that we're going to get smoke, but it's on whose terms. A low intensity burn doesn't put the carbon out into the atmosphere like a wildfire does. It's just really, it's really hard to look at a mountain that is so congested with trees that are just, inches apart and come to an understanding that you can help that. But as we started small, and then we're working to getting bigger and bigger and wiser. And, we're trying to promote life, not take life. So in certain seasons, we'll stop burning because of the animals are having their babies. They can't get away. And so we'll stop. Like now we're taking the middle of the summer off to let the animals do their thing, and then we'll pick up again in the fall. It's been a great trip, and it's helping to reconnect people with our land and our landscape, because we're on the lower Klamath River on the Yurok Reservation. It's been our ancestral territories since time immemorial. We're one of the few tribes that's never been displaced. And so in stewardship in this landscape, it's our responsibility as our very first understanding with our Creator to be where we're at and to thrive. He brought us fire and taught us how to use it in the proper context. To us, fire is like earth medicine. Too much medicine is not very good, but in the right amounts, it keeps us healthy. To try to help prevent these conflagrations of deadly fires that we've been having in Northern California and, the Northwest in general, it seems like it's super important to put forth this work and try real hard. I call them cultural burns and prescribed burns with cultural objectives, because a controlled fire, calling it a controlled fire, gives you the illusion that you're in control. So keeping that in mind as we move forward, and we're learning every day and learn with everybody I work with. And I'm not really sure where to go from here, but I'd be great, super happy to answer questions.
Thank you so much, Rick. We really appreciate your joining us and sharing with us today. We will transition now to a Q&A period. Michael, do you have any questions that you'd like to get us started with?
Thank you, Brooks. I have been hoping that there would be some Q&A questions in the chat and in the Q&A dialogue. I honestly have not a big clue on fire burning and the method of fire burning for thinning forests. Again, I'm in the Southeast, and in the Southeast, we have a completely different issue of deforestation, where they are stripping our trees unhealthy. And so it's not necessarily helping us in the fight for climate, but it's critical for our survival in our communities. And so we're experiencing flooding, and we're experiencing other harms because of the stripping of our trees. And then they place these biomass plants in our communities that are not only stripping us of our resources, but also stripping us of our health as well. And so in that, and I'm just going a long way to set that up to ask what is helpful and the thinning of trees through this fire method of versus what we are experiencing in the Southeast, because for me, that's an injustice in the Southeast. I don't know another way to put that, and I apologize that if I hadn't articulated that properly. Hopefully somebody can pick it up and go from there with it.
Can I weigh in? I think, Michael, it has so much to do with how we as humans view nature and what nature's role is in our lives. And I really see this up in the petroleum industry in Alberta, and it's really analogous to your situation in the Southeast with the forest, that this idea that nature is there to serve you as human beings, to serve us, to be a tool for us, to be an instrument for us, to manifest ourselves in a grander, more powerful way. And I think that attitude that it's really earth is our servant, it's to do here to do our bidding in any way that we see fit, is we're seeing it's a counterproductive way to engage with nature. And it's interesting that if you took a lot of individual people in the South and talked to them about nature, I'm sure they understand that. People who hunt, people who fish, they understand, you cannot catch a fish or eat a fish from polluted water. You need to look at the whole system. People can get that. People are a lot smarter than I think they're given credit for when we think about them en masse, like, oh, those people in the Southeast, or oh, those people in Alberta. You set them down like we're sitting down now, and you get some very lucid conversations going. So this idea of this kind of almost Old Testament Genesis derived attitude toward policy, it's almost like the government and the industry is taking its cues from the Old Testament in terms of, we have dominion over the earth, and here it is for us to manage as we see fit, and to somehow personalize it again, to humanize it, which is probably the wrong way to put it, but to naturalize it. In other words, to find a way to have that individual connection and sense of responsibility for the forest. And this is the real nut for me that I'm struggling to crack, is how do you make the leap from the individual, who's often really quite sensible and reasonable, to the institution, which suddenly starts behaving in this monolithic way, and, oh, we got to take care of our shareholders, or, oh, the law says we can do this, so therefore we can do it. And it's almost like a license to be inhuman, to be unnatural. And so going into that fissure, that crack between the individual and the institution, and rebuilding the connective tissue of responsibility, and the sense that this actually affects us directly, these choices and decisions that our policies, that our companies, that our governments make, is really touching us personally. And we need to push back on that. That feels like, and that's really, I feel like what a ministry does, in the most potent way, which is why I'm, proud to be with all of you today. But that's something that I've really struggled with, and I'm working on that right now. And, in terms of getting my book into the hands of politicians and other influential people, so that they can see and feel the connection between what people lose when their house burns down due to a forest fire, and our policies around creating a kind of open season attitude toward petroleum exploitation, which are, these are two things that are directly at odds with each other. And so I'm trying to highlight that, and I really feel solidarity with what you're trying to do, because I really think we're saying the same thing, just through different media. You have forests, we have forests. For you, it's biomass, which is really a medieval way of making energy. For us, it's melting tar, which is another medieval way of making energy. These are, we're better than that. We're smarter than that. And we have the tech right now to transcend that.
Thank you, John, for that response. And I really appreciate your kind of weaving in some of that, unfortunately, terrible kind of Christian theology, which serves as a background today still. Even on my local contemporary Christian radio station, I hear that theology encouraging investment in fossil fuel industry today. Just in the past week, I heard that advertisement on my local radio station. Wow. And so we're aware that's kind of that abuse of scripture is still going on, and many of us would say misinterpretation as well. We've got another question here kind of from the audience, drawing attention to the timber industry. Our audience member says there's a complicity from the timber industry for misinformation campaigns aimed at maximizing their profits. They're very successful with rallying their communities to sustain the damaging operations. Do you have any thoughts about challenging timber and embracing our neighbors in these communities? So that's a question from the audience. Any responses to that question?
Absolutely. I mean, I think that's a very valid and concerning point. I think what our organization and others are trying to do is make sure that in any of the congressional hearings and conversations that climate change comes into this. I think it's a lobby that has a lot of resources, and we're seeing the fruit of their labor, I think, for sure, and some of the policy recommendations that are coming up at all different angles, different agencies, and what have you. So I think it's definitely a challenge there. And first and foremost is making sure we get the correct information out there about climate change and the true impacts. And that's why, we started out with our recommendations on accountability, and then ultimately, first reducing our emissions so we can stop making the problem worse. But I'm not a timber expert. I just wanted to weigh in on some of the higher level stuff.
Thank you. I appreciate that, Shana. John, did you want to jump in, or should I move to our next question?
I don't know does Rick want to weigh in on that at all? Or, I mean, I've got a quick thing to say, but.
Well, yeah, I think that the whole timber industry is going into the regions and like changing the climate and the vegetation from, well, like in our area, from a primarily oak savanna into a congested Douglas fir conflagration, which is setting us up for failure. The change in the timber policy is an essential part of creating positive change.
I mean, it really goes back to using nature for profit. And it's a colonial model that was really, frankly, pioneered in Canada through the Hudson's Bay Company and the beaver fur industry that started literally in the 1600s. And has been going ever since. There's still a fur industry. There's still this attitude that nature is here for us to take profit from, and that you can kind of rob the cookie jar. And the way that we've structured corporations with shareholders that need to be served, even though they're essentially faceless, sets up this situation where it's almost a license to act like a sociopath. And so that, well, we have to do everything to keep our bottom line in the black. We have to do everything to keep our shareholders happy and not selling our stock and buying something else. So that becomes the overarching concern. That becomes the most righteous thing you can do. And the trouble is that leads CEOs and the people under them to make decisions that really have no moral compass. Even though they might be moral people individually, if we sat down with them, if they were on this panel right now, we might find a lot to agree on. There's something about the structure of the corporation colluded, in conjunction with what government allows it to do, that creates a situation for people to behave in really inhumane, amoral, rapacious ways that are demonstrably destructive to nature. And that again, it's kind of going back to this nut that I'm trying to crack, is how do we bridge that gap between the individual human, who might be really quite reasonable and wanting to do the right thing, and the institution they work for that is more concerned with its own monolithic survival at really any cost. And we're really seeing that with the petroleum industry now, certainly seeing that with the timber industry that has this basically 17th century attitude toward landscape. And that is not suitable for the current needs, and it's not suitable or conducive to survival or real prosperity.
Question for you. Sorry about that. It says, I have been impressed by the Australians using fire to manage landscapes. As a native plant enthusiast, what happens is that the plant species that are adapted to fire come in and the introduced species disappear. Rewilding is big. How does the church discuss the stewardship of our planet? How can we support this? Every bioregion has a natural regime of natural carbon recycling and regrowth. Chaparral, prairie, temperate forest, etc. Anybody, everybody.
In some ways, we can refer to maybe some of our past webinars that we've done on native landscaping and so forth, and Douglas Tallamy. But feel free, any of our panelists, if you want to kind of jump in on your perspectives on how native plants, species, and so forth relate to this issue we're talking about today.
Well, I'll jump.
Well,
go ahead. You go,
sorry,
Rick.
go ahead.
No, Rick, I defer to you. This is your zone.
Okay. In our landscape, we avoid the leave no trace policy. We insert ourselves into our landscape and into our climates and into, our land. So we take care, we manage with fire. Well, we did until up to 150 years ago, and now just bringing it back. The reintroduction of fire into our landscape has reshaped it and reformed it, and like I said, in leaps and bounds, creating safety zones and corridors to protect our communities. And we do fuel reductions around our elders' houses and schools and our infrastructure. We maintain a healthy relationship with our local, state, and federal authorities, creating trust relationships and coming up with plans that are conducive to bringing balance back into our world. By not inserting yourself into your landscape, you're just letting it do whatever it's going to do, and the invasives will come in, and you'll have these catastrophic wildfires that essentially moonscape the landscape, and the only thing that comes back there is invasives, because they'll grow out of a rock. They're very hardy. So being part of your landscape and your climate and environment is essential.
Thank you, Rick, for that helpful response. I've got a follow-up question for you, Rick. In a way, you'd mentioned in your answer there some interrelationship with government entities, and one of our questions is about that. What is kind of the current state of play in terms of cultural burning practices and, say, the state of California, like in terms of on the policy level? Has there been movement there? Kind of what's the conversation? What's the potential moving forward? Can you address that a little bit for us?
Yes. Well, in the past few years, with these catastrophic wildfires going through and decimating the land and towns and loss of life, CAL FIRE has changed their outlook on fire, where it was essentially an initial attack to put out and suppress any and all fires, to the point where they are being proactive in fuel reductions, such as prescribed fire. They've allotted a lot of money and a lot of manpower to help with this problem. It's a big problem. We're not going to solve it overnight, but as we create these trust relationships with these agencies, it's helping to strengthen our objectives and our plans to move forward to hopefully burn up to 5 million acres a year in California with prescribed fire. Where it was before, I think in pre-contact, I think it was estimated at 21 million acres a year was burned.
I guess what I'm trying to really convey in my questioning, and where my thought is that this is not a one size fit all solution. And I would hope that we wouldn't walk away from this and think that it is a one size fit all solution. As I'm relaying, this on the West Coast may be a solution, but it's a hindrance or a burden on the East Coast. It's created a burden in the way that we, as Brother John spoke of earlier, in the way that we look at our nature. We don't see ourselves as a part of nature. We see ourselves as somehow divorced from it and lording over it, instead of working with it. And I would hope that even in the questioning about the native plants and our native participation even with the environment comes to mind in our conscience and in our faith. I didn't really have a question as much as I wanted to make that statement.
Yeah, no, thank you, Michael. Yeah, as we come near the end of our time together, one thing I was thinking we might do is, John, in your book, I was kind of pleasantly, I don't know if surprised is the right word, but towards the end of your book, you bring in a well-known faith figure, Hildegard von Bingen. And so I'm curious if you could just share a little bit of that with us, and then maybe we can use that as a touchstone for kind of closing comments from each of our panelists as we move forward towards our ending here.
Brooks, I'd be really glad to. One of the things that struck me going into these places that had been absolutely ravaged, and as Rick said, moonscaped by these fires, Fort McMurray, and then I also was on scene in Redding, California, that had an actual EF3 fire tornado burn through it. And that is, that's nuclear energy, the likes of which no human has ever seen. And I was there a couple of months after, and the ground had been torn away. The soil was gone, the bark was gone, the houses were gone, literally swept away and burned, and truly apocalyptic. And yet there were these little green shoots coming through the fire-baked earth. And they were so out of place, they looked like plastic plants. And I went up closer to look at them, and they were alive. Like the roots were under there waiting for the catastrophe to pass so that they could reemerge. And it really, was a holy moment to witness this, especially after this kind of extraordinary devastation. And so this idea of this growing back, it's a beautiful word called revirescence, the revirescence, the regrowing, the regreening. And that is something that nothing does better than planet Earth. There's no other place in the universe we know of that wants to grow, that wants to heal, that wants to be whole so fervently and intently over such a long period of time. Our planet has been doing this literally for billions of years, regenerating itself after all manner of catastrophe. So Hildegard of Bingen, I think she was a 10th century Benedictine nun in the Rhine Valley, what is now Germany. She was really a polymath. She was just an extraordinary genius for her time and for any time. and especially as a woman in that time, as a nun in that time, wielded tremendous power in her community. She was an abbess. She had correspondence with popes and dukes and kings, and she was also a naturalist and a true visionary. So her visions have been painted, and you can go and see them, the paintings and visions of Hildegard of Bingen. But she used a Latin word, which was the language she wrote in, which is viriditas. And viriditas is Latin for greening, the making green of something. But the way she writes about it, and the way I think her descendants, people like us, have come to understand it, is it's greening energy. And I think that is such a powerful concept. And it's something that really, for most of human history, we have been very, very connected to. We have been farmers, we have been foragers, we have been reverers, celebrators of the forest and of the life force bursting out of the ground all over the world. And we have to remember that this experiment in a fire-powered civilization, in a petroleum-powered civilization, is only 150 years old. And our species is hundreds of thousands of years old. Our civilization is 10,000 years old, probably even older than that. And so this moment that we're in now is an aberration, and it's an experiment. And it's an experiment that's not going very well. We have a lot of data now that it's much healthier and much more conducive to long-term survival to focus on greening energy, to focus on reverescence, to focus on viriditas, than to focus on burning everything in sight.
Thank you, John, for sharing that. Shana and Rick, as we wrap up, just to play off on that, are there any green shoots in life that you see popping up in your work? Think of that metaphorically or literally, but I just kind of invite you to play off that as we come to a close. Rick, do you have any thoughts?
Yes, I do, actually. And John, thank you for that. That was very enlightening. In our units that we have been applying fire to, we see a huge amount of flowers and medicine plants and food plants, and invasives are getting thinner. And as well as the regreening, there's also a rehydration, because in the units where we're removing stems per acres, we're seeing water coming up out of the ground where there hasn't been water. So fire and water are hand in hand with cleaning up the earth and helping to help our survival. Clean water is clean health. And like I say to everybody is educate yourself on fire and see what the advantages versus disadvantages are. Because we could tell you all day long, but if you see for yourself, it's real.
Thank you, Rick. Shana.
Yes, we could pull up the last slide if it's not too much trouble, but I think some of the good news is we have the science. We know kind of where we are when it comes to climate change, and at the Union of Concerned Scientists have a lot of resources for you. So, one of the comments talked about how maybe a lot of the focus has been on corporations, but I try to make the point that, we have a handful of buckets where recommendations are being placed, and the, fossil fuel industry and cement companies are just one of many actors that need to be, be part of the solution. And so just, we at the UCS have these different resources available, state fact sheets, if you want to kind of go to your legislator and talk about some of these impacts, especially if you live in some of the Western states. We also have resources for other issues that you may care about. But I guess I'll leave it there, and I really appreciate you all bringing this topic up and the questions as well.
Thank you so much, Shana. I tell you, I feel like this has been a webinar that I've wanted to see happen for a long time, because I feel like when we see the news stories about wildfires, we're getting all the bad news, but we're not getting the bigger perspective and understanding of it. We're not getting what the policy level recommendations should be that we should be pursuing and implementing right now. We're not hearing from practitioners on the ground like Rick, who are living out a way forward for us right now. And so to have all three of you together on this just makes me tremendously grateful. Thanks to each of you for sharing and bringing your wisdom, insights, and knowledge to us today. So we thank you with all our hearts for your being with us today.